There comes a moment when you stop explaining yourself, not out of anger, not out of distance. You just realize you don't need to anymore. You stop correcting every misunderstanding. Stop justifying every choice. Stop making yourself easier to digest. And something shifts. Some people feel it immediately. Others resist it. A few quietly step back. Because when you stop explaining, you're no longer negotiating who you are. Your words slow down. Your presence deepens. Your silence begins to speak. This isn't withdrawal. It's alignment. And once it happens, nothing relates to you the same way again. Most people don't start explaining themselves as adults. They learn it early. As children, a raised eyebrow, a sudden silence, a look that says something went wrong. So you talk. You explain what you meant. You explain why you did it. You explain that you didn't mean it that way. Not because you were lying, but because you wanted the tension to stop. At home, you learn to justify your tone. At school, you learn to defend your intentions. With adults, you learned that being misunderstood could change how you were treated. So you adapted. You learned that clarity wasn't just communication. It was protection. Over time, this becomes automatic. You sense confusion before it's spoken, discomfort before it's named, judgment before it lands, and you move to explain. Quickly, carefully, preemptively, because somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned a rule. If I explain myself well enough, I stay safe. This is why the habit feels responsible, why it looks mature, why it often goes unnoticed. But psychologically, it has a cost. You begin speaking from anticipation instead of presence, from defense instead of center. Carl Jung described this as identification with the persona, the part of the psyche that learns how to be acceptable. The persona isn't fake. It's functional. But when it runs the system, you start adjusting who you are, before anyone even asks. So you soften statements. You add context. You explain emotions in advance. Not because you don't know who you are, but because you've learned to manage how others receive you. And that's why explaining yourself too much doesn't feel grounding. It feels tiring, because you're not responding to the present moment. You're responding to a memory of being misunderstood, until one day, that impulse begins to fade. Not suddenly, not dramatically. You just pause, and for the first time, you don't rush to make yourself clear. That pause is small, but psychologically, it changes everything. That pause doesn't stay empty. It begins to reshape how you experience yourself. In moments that used to feel automatic, instead of moving outward, your attention turns inward. You start noticing how often your body used to react, before your thoughts had time to arrive. How quickly words came, not to express something meaningful, but to discharge tension. Now that reflex loosens. You don't suppress it. You don't resist it. You simply don't obey it. And in that small act of non-reaction, your internal rhythm changes. Your breathing deepens without effort. Your shoulders drop. Your jaw softens. The body registers safety. Before the mind explains anything, your thoughts slow down as well. They stop running ahead of the moment, trying to predict responses, misunderstandings, outcomes. They stop rehearsing explanations for conversations that haven't happened yet. Instead, they begin responding to what is actually present. This shift is subtle, but it's profound, because for the first time, you are no longer organizing yourself around potential reactions. Your energy, once spread outward, begins to gather. You feel more contained, more centered, less fragmented, and with that containment, silence changes texture. It no longer feels like absence. It no longer feels like risk. It feels like choice. You notice yourself allowing pauses to exist, letting sentences end without adding footnotes, letting expressions stand without explanation, not as a strategy, not as a boundary, but because you no longer feel the internal pressure to be immediately understood. This is where regulation replaces reaction. You begin to sense that misunderstanding does not equal danger, that being misread does not threaten your stability, that your nervous system does not need constant reassurance from external feedback. Over time, this creates a deeper reorganization. You stop measuring yourself through response. You stop adjusting based on facial cues, tone shifts, silence. You stop scanning for signs that something went wrong, not because you've become indifferent, but because you've become anchored. Your sense of self is no longer negotiated in real time. It remains steady, even when connection feels ambiguous, even when responses are delayed, even when clarity doesn't arrive. And something important happens here. You begin to experience yourself as whole, without constant clarification. This realization isn't intellectual. It's physical. You feel it in your posture, in the way you listen, in the way you occupy space. Your presence grows quieter, but denser, less reactive, but more grounded. This is why the change feels irreversible. Once your system learns that it can remain regulated without constant explanation, returning to old patterns feels unnatural. Not wrong, not forbidden, just unnecessary. And from that internal stability, everything else begins to reorganize. Your timing, your boundaries, your relationships. But that comes next. The first thing that changes is not what people say. It's how they feel around you. Your silence is noticed, even when nothing is mentioned, even when no one names it directly, because something in the familiar rhythm is missing. You're still present, still attentive, still engaged, but you're no longer offering explanations as a form of comfort, and that absence does something to the space between you and others. For some people, it creates curiosity. They listen more carefully. They wait longer before responding. They start paying attention not just to your words, but to your timing, your tone, your stillness. Your presence feels denser. For others, the experience is different. They feel unsettled, without being able to explain why. The silence feels ambiguous, open-ended, unmanaged. So they try to restore the old dynamic. They fill the pauses. They over-explain in your place. They ask questions that aren't really questions. Are you okay? Did I do something? You seem quiet lately. Not because something is wrong, but because they no longer feel oriented by you. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop regulating other people's comfort. And not everyone knows how to sit with that. Some begin projecting meaning onto your silence. They interpret it as distance, as judgment, as withdrawal, not because that's what it is, but because they're no longer being guided through your internal process. This is where misunderstandings increase, not because you've become unclear, but because you've stopped managing clarity on behalf of everyone else. Over time, this reveals something important about connection. Many relationships are built around invisible roles. One person explains, the other relaxes. One person clarifies, the other feels secure. One person translates themselves constantly, so the relationship can remain smooth. When that role disappears, the structure of the relationship changes. Some people adapt. They meet you in the pause. They ask instead of assume. They tolerate not knowing everything right away. Others don't. They become restless, defensive, distant, not because you did something wrong, but because the relationship depended on you carrying the emotional labor quietly. This is the filtering phase. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with confrontation. It shows up in small ways. Conversations shorten. Energy shifts. Certain dynamics no longer sustain themselves. And while this can feel like loss, it's more accurate to see it as reorganization. You're no longer relating from explanation. You're relating from presence. And presence has a way of revealing which connections were mutual and which ones relied on you being endlessly available, endlessly clear, endlessly accommodating. You don't announce this change. You don't justify it. You simply remain consistent. And over time, people stop responding to your silence and start responding to your stability. Some step closer, some step away. Both movements carry information. What you're experiencing isn't random. That subtle shift in how people respond to you, the reorganization of closeness and distance, has a psychological structure behind it. Carl Jung described this structure through the idea of the persona. The persona is not a lie. It's not inauthentic. It's adaptive. It's the part of the psyche that learns how to be acceptable, understandable, readable. It develops early. It learns when to speak, when to soften, when to explain. And for a long time, it works. It helps you belong. It helps you avoid conflict. It helps you stay connected. But there is a cost. The more energy you invest in maintaining the persona, the more your sense of self becomes tied to how smoothly interactions flow, to how little friction there is, to how well you are received. This is why constant explanation feels necessary. It keeps the persona intact. It reassures others, and quietly it reassures you. But when you stop explaining yourself, the persona loses one of its main supports. And that's when things begin to shift at a deeper level. People aren't just reacting to your silence. They're reacting to the absence of a familiar psychological signal. You're no longer signaling availability through explanation. You're no longer smoothing meaning in advance. You're no longer managing how you're perceived moment by moment. This creates uncertainty, and uncertainty reveals hierarchy. Not social hierarchy, psychological hierarchy. Because when someone doesn't need to explain themselves, they're no longer positioning others as the authority over their inner state. They're no longer asking implicitly, "Is this okay? Did I say it right? Do you understand me now?" They're standing in something quieter. That quietness is often misread as confidence, or distance, or power. But psychologically, it's something else. It's orientation. The center has shifted from outside validation to inner reference. This is where individuation begins, not as a dramatic awakening, not as a declaration, but as a subtle withdrawal of psychic energy from the persona back toward the self. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming what you already are, not what adapts best. And one of the earliest signs of that process is the reduced need to explain, because explanation belongs to the persona. Presence belongs to the self. The self doesn't argue for its existence. It doesn't translate itself endlessly. It doesn't rush to be understood. It simply is. This is why, when you stop explaining yourself, some people feel destabilized. They were relating to the persona, the accessible, interpretable version of you. Now they're encountering something less predictable, less negotiable, and that can feel like loss. But it isn't. It's exposure. Exposure to a version of you that is no longer shaped primarily by relational comfort. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop orienting your identity around being easily digestible. And that shift has consequences. Not all relationships survive individuation. Not all dynamics adjust, because some connections were built around the persona doing constant work, explaining, clarifying, soothing. When that labor stops, what remains becomes visible. This is why the process feels both grounding and lonely at times. You gain inner coherence, but you lose certain forms of alignment. And Jung was clear about this. Individuation is not a path toward comfort. It's a path toward wholeness. When you stop explaining yourself, you're not rejecting others. You're withdrawing psychic energy from roles that no longer reflect who you are becoming. You're allowing misunderstanding without collapsing. You're allowing silence without filling it. And that is not social withdrawal. It's psychological maturation. The world doesn't respond to you the same way anymore because you are no longer meeting it from the same internal position. And once that shift occurs, there is no clean way back, only forward. There is a cost to this shift, not a dramatic one, not an obvious one, but a real one. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin to notice moments of quiet separation. Conversations don't flow the same way. Some exchanges feel shorter. Certain people no longer reach for you automatically, not because you became distant, but because you stopped bridging every gap. And at first, this can feel unsettling. There are moments when you wonder if you're being misunderstood on purpose, if your silence is being read as indifference, if you should step in and clarify, just to restore ease. This is where the old reflex tries to return, the impulse to smooth things over, to explain your tone, to reassure, to make yourself easier to approach again. And sometimes you do. Not every silence needs to be protected. Not every explanation is a mistake. Maturity isn't rigidity, but something has changed. You no longer explain to avoid discomfort. You no longer translate yourself just to keep emotional equilibrium. You choose more carefully where your energy goes. This choice has consequences. Some people interpret your quietness as withdrawal. Others feel excluded from an intimacy they were used to having. A few take it personally. They assume the silence is about them because they're accustomed to access. And this is where the loneliness appears. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of no longer being overextended. You realize that some connections were sustained by your effort to stay legible, your constant availability, your willingness to clarify everything, your habit of making yourself understandable before anyone asked. When that effort stops, the relationship reveals its true structure. This can be painful, not because the connection was false, but because it was asymmetrical. You were holding more of the emotional weight than you realized, and now that weight is gone. What replaces it isn't emptiness. It's space. Space that can feel unfamiliar. Quiet that can feel exposed. You're no longer filling every pause with explanation. You're no longer rescuing moments of ambiguity. And sometimes that means sitting alone with your own steadiness while others adjust or don't. This is the part no one romanticizes. The part where growth feels lonely. Not because you lost people, but because you stopped overfunctioning. Where maturity doesn't feel empowering. It feels sober. But there's something important happening here. You're learning the difference between connection and obligation, between intimacy and access, between being understood and being centered. You're discovering that not everyone is meant to stay close. Once you stop explaining who you are, and that doesn't make the process cold, it makes it honest, because the silence you're choosing now isn't absence. It's integrity, and integrity always comes with a quieter circle. At a certain point, this way of being stops feeling like a choice. It becomes your baseline, You no longer think about whether you should explain. You no longer debate silence versus words. You simply respond from where you are. And that's when something important settles inside you. You realize that you are no longer negotiating your existence. In real time, you're not checking whether your tone landed correctly. You're not monitoring reactions to adjust yourself mid-interaction. You're not shaping your inner world to remain acceptable. You're standing in it. This doesn't make you unreachable. It makes you clear. Clear in a way that doesn't require elaboration. Your presence carries coherence now. Not intensity. Not dominance. Coherence. People sense it before you speak. They feel it in the pauses you allow. In the way you don't rush to correct assumptions. In the way you let others sit with their own interpretations. This is not silence as strategy. It's silence as consequence. A consequence of having an internal reference strong enough that you no longer need to externalize it constantly. This is where individuation becomes lived, not conceptual. Carl Jung was clear about this. The individuated person does not withdraw from the world, but they also no longer dissolve into it. They participate, without being absorbed. They relate, without over-identifying. They allow misunderstanding, without collapsing into explanation. That's the balance you're stepping into now, and it changes how power operates around you. Not power as control, but power as non-reactivity. When you don't rush to explain yourself, you don't hand over authority, over your inner state. You don't invite others to validate or invalidate who you are. You let their reactions exist, without turning them into instructions. This is deeply unsettling for some people, because many social dynamics rely on quick clarification, on immediate reassurance, on emotional availability as proof of care. When that disappears, people are forced to confront their own discomfort. Some rise to it, others don't. And this is where discernment replaces effort. You no longer chase alignment. You observe it. You no longer try to be understood everywhere. You notice where understanding flows naturally. Your circle becomes quieter, smaller, but more accurate. And with that accuracy comes relief. Not excitement, not triumph. Relief. The relief of not performing coherence anymore. The relief of not explaining yourself into exhaustion. The relief of not carrying responsibility for how everyone experiences you. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They think stopping explanation is about detachment, about indifference, about becoming unreachable. It's not. It's about becoming non-fragmented, about no longer splitting yourself into what you feel and what you need to say to make it acceptable. You become singular, and singularity changes everything. You speak less, but with more precision. You listen more, without absorbing what doesn't belong to you. You allow space, without rushing to fill it. And in that space, others reveal themselves, their expectations, their assumptions, their dependence on access. You don't confront it. You don't analyze it out loud. You simply notice, and noticing becomes enough. This is the quiet maturity that no one warns you about, the kind that doesn't feel empowering at first, the kind that feels still. But over time, you realize something profound. Nothing essential was lost. When you stopped explaining yourself, what fell away was what required constant effort to maintain. What remains is what can stand on its own. So if things feel different now, if conversations have changed, if certain people seem closer or farther, if silence no longer feels dangerous, that's not a mistake. That's integration. You're no longer trying to be understood. Before you're grounded. Before you speak. And once that order reverses, There is no returning to the old way, only a quieter, steadier way forward. If this resonated with you, you don't need to explain why. Some shifts are meant to be recognized, not justified. If you're moving through this quieter phase, where you speak less, observe more, and feel things settling differently inside, you're not alone in it. Take what you need from this, and leave the rest. And if you want to continue this exploration of depth, individuation, and the quiet changes that reshape us, you'll find more here. Not answers, just clarity.